The Parthians, a name which many recognise but few know much about. I, for one, first learned of the Parthians through the prism of their relationship and long-time antagonism with the Romans, a rivalry which lasted many hundreds of years and saw countless campaigns back and forth across the border territories which divided these two great empires. And as always, before we continue, I want to be honest with you. This isn't a flashy, fast-paced documentary. If you're expecting new visuals on screen every 10 seconds, I would recommend you to literally turn off the video, because this is not for you. But for those who are here for actual detailed ancient history, let's continue. There is so much more to the Parthians than their antagonism with Rome. Growing out of the conquests of a tribe of Iranian nomads as the mighty Seleucid Empire, the successor state to Alexander the Great's conquests in the east, fell about them. The Parthians rapidly filled the political vacuum and established a vast and long-lasting polity which would dominate Iran and beyond for centuries. Through a combination of astute political manoeuvring, cultural flexibility, and martial prowess, the Arsacid dynasty, which sat on the throne of Parthia from the mid-3rd century BC to the early 3rd century AD, successfully established Parthia as a great power, rivaling and at times directly competing with the power of Han China and Imperial Rome. Parthian armies, with their serried ranks of masked cavalry, struck fear into the enemies of the Arsacids. Parthia itself was made fantastically wealthy through a mixture of verdant agriculture, mineral bounty, and the exploitation of trade passing along the famous Silk Road. Their Zoroastrian religion, their eclectic art, the Parthians are a fascinating and little explored people. Therefore, today, we will dive into the history of this empire and attempt to answer the question, who were the Parthians? The region known as Parthia, an area which corresponds to modern northeastern Iran and parts of southwestern Turkmenistan, was well known in antiquity. Conquered by the Medes in the 7th century BC, the region was held as a province by a succession of empires: the Achaemenid Persian Empire, the Empire of Alexander the Great, and the resulting Hellenistic Seleucid Empire. However, rather misleadingly, it would seem that it is not within the confines of Parthia itself that we must search for the origins of the Parthians and their empire. Rather, it is further east with a nomadic Iranian people named the Parni that the earliest history of the Parthians begins. Of the Parni we know frustratingly little. There are no clear Iranian sources which cover them, and the Greek and Roman sources on which our attempts at understanding inevitably fall lack detail, and at times appear rather confused. There does, however, seem to be something of a consensus in asserting that the Parni belong to a wider tribal grouping known as the Dahai, an eastern Iranian confederation of nomads which controlled the land between the Caspian and Aral seas. Strabo, writing in the late 1st century BC, stated that the Parni dwelt on the banks of the Oshus River. With the Parni, called nomads, a tribe of the Dahai who live in the banks of the Oshus. The Oshus was a tributary of the larger Oxus River, and is today known as the Panj, flowing along the border of Afghanistan and Tajikistan. In another passage he states that the Apani, which it is argued is Strabo giving another name to the Parni, dwelt close to Hyrcania and the Caspian Sea. However, in yet another passage, Strabo also notes that they say that the Dahai Parni were an immigrant tribe from the Dahai above the Maotes, who are called Zandi and Pari. The Maotis was an ancient name for the Sea of Azov, which appears to suggest a totally different location for the Parni. Given that these are amongst our only sources, it is not hard to see why the origins of the Parni are so hard to place. However, in this locating of the elusive Iranian nomads north of the Black Sea, Strabo is joined by the 2nd century AD Roman historian Justin, who believed the Parthians to have originally migrated to their lands near the Caspian Sea due to military pressure from the Scythians, a people who dwelt on the Pontic steppe in antiquity. The Parthians were originally exiles from Scythia. This is apparent from their very name, for in the Scythian language exiles are called Parthi. The confusion in the sources reflects the difficulty ancient Mediterranean writers had in understanding the complex ethnic geography of Central Asia. The steppe peoples were mobile, their territories fluid, and their relationships with settled civilizations episodic. To Greek and Roman observers, trying to map these groups onto fixed geographical locations was inherently problematic. Whether they hailed from the banks of the Ochus, the region east of the Caspian Sea, or the Pontic steppe, the Parni made a major move in the mid-3rd century BC. Apparently pressured by the onset of the Scythians or other nomadic peoples to the north, the Parni began to encroach upon territories ruled by the Seleucid Empire. In 280 BC, an attempted invasion of Margiana was staged, a region of the Seleucid satrapy or province of Bactria. Although repulsed by the satrap Diodotus, the Parni remained a threat in the region. This initial failed invasion demonstrates that the Parni were already a formidable military force, capable of threatening established Seleucid provinces even if not yet able to conquer them outright. In the early 240s BC, political upheaval within the wider Seleucid Empire set the stage for the Parni to invade the province of Parthia. Antiochus Theon, the Seleucid emperor since 261 BC, was primarily engaged throughout his reign in military campaigns in the west of his realm, notably against the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt. This focus on the west left the eastern portions of the sprawling Seleucid Empire vulnerable to invasion and rebellion. In 255 BC, the aforementioned satrap of Bactria had rebelled, establishing the independent Greco-Bactrian kingdom, and in 245 BC, satrap Andragoras of Parthia followed suit. Antiochus II, preoccupied in the west and hundreds of miles from his troublesome eastern provinces, could do little to react. Independence, however, came at a price. These newly established breakaway states were increasingly vulnerable to foreign invasion now that the prestige of Seleucid overlordship had been removed. In the 240 SBC, another change occurred, this time amongst the Parni. It was during the 240s that a man named Arsaces likely became the leader of this nomadic people. It was Arsaces, who may have been elected to the throne of the Parni, who initiated the movement of his people into Parthia in the form of a violent invasion in 239 or 238 BC. It is unknown exactly how this conquest was achieved, nor how long the process took. Bivar thinks it likely that the Parni captured a smaller northern region first, before gradually expanding their control over the whole of Parthia and Hyrcania over a number of years. Having stormed into the historical record, the Parni rapidly conquered Parthia. However, their rule was by no means secure nor strongly established. In the febrile political atmosphere of the late 3rd century BC, these new Parthians would have to fight to protect their new territories. With Parthia taken, the Parni under Arsaces were met with no immediate reprisals from the Seleucids. The empire, riven by a succession crisis and civil conflict following the death of Antiochus Thecca in 246 BC, was in no position to enforce its hegemony over the provinces in the Far East. Arsaces' primary concern in the years following the initial conquest of Parthia by the Parni was the solidification of his rule. It appears that the cultural flexibility of the Parni was central in their consolidation of power, as they seem to have rapidly adopted the local Parthian language and themselves began to be known as Parthians, a move which no doubt aided them in establishing control over their newly conquered territories. This linguistic and cultural adaptation represents a remarkable pragmatism on the part of the Parni leadership. Rather than attempting to impose their nomadic steppe culture on the sedentary agricultural populations of Parthia, they adopted local practices while maintaining their military effectiveness. This pattern of cultural synthesis would characterize Parthian rule throughout the empire's existence. Despite this, the entirety of Parthia was by no means conquered in one fell swoop. Rather, it seems more likely that Parni incursions began in the highland regions in the 240s BC, before years of campaigning finally brought the entirety of the satrapies of Parthia and Hyrcania under the rule of Arsaces by 239 or 238 BC. Similarly, despite his evident political authority, Arsaces does not appear to have presented himself as a totally independent ruler. Instead, he is referred to on early Parthian coinage as Arsaces Autocrator. Autocrator, or the Greek autocrator, would denote authority greater than that of a governor or satrap, but not on par with that of a basileus or emperor. Such a moniker may suggest that this new Parthian realm still viewed itself as being a dependency of the wider Seleucid Empire, a vassal state whose dynasty still looked to the Seleucids for legitimacy. Indeed, on their coinage, the first three rulers of the Parthians, Arsaces I, Arsaces II, and Phraorpatius, did not refer to themselves as kings. The rule of Arsaces, the founder of the Parthian Arsacid dynasty to which he lent his name, was highly successful. Not only did he capture the provinces of Parthia and Hyrcania, but he was able to endure an abortive Seleucid attempt to regain the province in around the year 228 BC. Arsaces is also credited with the founding of the city of Nisa, which would go on to become the royal centre of the Parthians until the mid-1st century BC. In the words of Justin, his rule was a constructive if militaristic one. He settled the Parthian government, levied soldiers, built fortresses, and strengthened his towns. Let me show you numbers that illustrate Arsaces' achievements. The territory under Arsaces' control at his death in approximately 211 BC encompassed roughly 150,000 square kilometers, comparable to modern Tunisia. The population of this territory may have numbered between 300,000 and 500,000 people. Arsaces minted coins from at least 3 different cities, demonstrating the extent of his administrative control. The fortifications he built included at least a dozen major strongholds, protecting key routes and agricultural regions. Arsaces' son and successor, also named Arsaces, who is understood to have assumed the throne in 217 BC, presided over a period in which a resurgent Seleucid Empire, under the proactive emperor Antiochus III, sought to regain many of its previously lost possessions, including the province of Parthia. Defeated at the 209 BC Battle of Mount Labus, Arsaces II was forced to accept Seleucid overlordship. However, a series of disastrous campaigns waged by the Seleucids against the Roman Republic in the west seriously weakened Antiochus's grip on the eastern provinces, allowing the Parthians to reassert their independence and possibly expand their territory still further. The Battle of Magnesia in 190 BC where Antiochus III suffered a catastrophic defeat at the hands of the Romans, proved to be the turning point. The peace treaty that followed imposed crippling indemnities on the Seleucids and restricted their military capacity. With Seleucid attention focused on managing these western disasters, the eastern provinces effectively became autonomous. This stabilization of their rule continued into the reign of Arsaces-Tseku's successors, who conquered the Albers Mountains. However, their realm was by no means stabilized at this time, and it was only the relative weakness and political infighting of the Seleucids that prevented the empire from successfully launching a retaliatory campaign. It was during the reign of the great Mithridates the Young that the Parthians truly established themselves as the preeminent power in the region. Mithridates I was actually the brother of his predecessor Phraates. Phraates apparently believed his sons to be inferior candidates for the throne. It has been theorized that this succession was an example of the nomadic practice of rulers appointing their brothers to be their successors. According to the historian Justin, Phraates' decision was made for the good of the nation, stating that he left the throne in preference to his brother Mithridates, a man of extraordinary ability, thinking that more was due to the name of king than to that of father, and he ought to consult the interests of his country rather than those of his children. In any case, Mithridates can perhaps be considered the true founder of the Parthian Empire, for it was through his conquest that Parthian territory and political power expanded enormously. Beginning his reign in 165 or 164 BC, Mithridates embarked upon a series of ambitious campaigns. In the east, the Bactrians, who had gained independence from the Seleucids little more than a decade before the satrapy of Parthia, bore the brunt of Mithridates' aggression. Herat was swiftly taken before being used as a staging post by the Parthians, who by 155 BC had captured as far east as Margiana, the city of Merv, Gurganj, and the city of Bactria itself, permanently damaging the prestige of the Greco-Bactrian kingdom and condemning it to a terminal decline which would see this Seleucid successor state cease to exist in the 120s BC. To the west, Parthian expansion into Media began perhaps as early as 158 BC, and in 148 or 147 BC, the Median, Achaemenid, and Seleucid capital of Ecbatana was captured, an extremely prestigious city which would go on to form one of the most important political and economic centres of the Parthian Empire. The capture of Ecbatana represented an enormous symbolic and practical victory for Mithridates. Ecbatana had served as the summer capital of the Achaemenid Persian Empire and remained one of the most important cities in Iran. Its capture gave Mithridates control over the central Iranian plateau and the wealth that flowed through this strategic location. In 141 BC, a campaign was waged, which saw the fall of the cities of Seleucia and Babylon to the Parthians, along with large parts of Mesopotamia, including Characene and Elymais. A campaign launched by the final Greco-Bactrian king Eucratides, as aimed at reconquering lost territory, was swiftly seen off by Mithridates, as was an attempted invasion by an Iranian nomadic people from the north known as the Sarka. Mithridates' troops also succeeded in capturing the young Seleucid emperor Demetrius II, who was subsequently held captive in Hyrcania, effectively neutralizing any potential Seleucid threats for a time. By the time of his death in 132 BC, apparently from a stroke, Mithridates ruled over a vastly expanded Parthian realm and had effectively laid the foundations of empire. In Seleucia and Ecbatana, Coins were minted in his name, referring to him as Basileus Megas, meaning great king or emperor. And he married his daughter to the captive Seleucid emperor Demetrius II, both moves which demonstrated Mithridates' political dominance. Let me show you the numbers that reveal the scale of Mithridates III's conquests. At his accession in 165 BC, the Parthian realm covered approximately 150,000 square kilometers. At his death in 132 BC, it had expanded to over 1 million square kilometers, nearly a seven-fold increase. The population under Parthian rule grew from perhaps 500,000 to over 5 million people. Mithridates' campaigns covered distances exceeding 3,000 kilometers from east to west, from the borders of Bactria to Mesopotamia. The reign of Phraates Tuda, Mithridates' son and successor, began with the last serious attempt by the Seleucids to recapture ground lost to the Parthians. The brother of the captured Demetrius II, Antiochus VII, raised an enormous force, successfully capturing Babylon and Media in 130 BC. In an attempt to foment civil war amongst the Seleucids, Phraates actually freed the captive Demetrius II. Despite the failure of this plan, civil revolt against the Seleucid occupation in 129 BC led to widespread unrest which Phraates exploited, defeating and killing Antiochus VII at the Battle of Ecbatana later that year. This significant defeat effectively broke the power of the Seleucids, confining their rule to Syria. The remainder of Phraates II's rule, and the reigns of his short-lived successors named Artabanus III and Mithridates II, were relatively stable other than incursions by the nomadic Saka and Tocharians. The reign of Mithridates II, however, lasting from 121 to 91 BC, was altogether more eventful. Considered one of the great kings of Parthia, Mithridates consolidated Parthian rule over the previously contested territories in Media and Mesopotamia, subjugated the troublesome Saka in the east, making them a tributary state, invaded and partially conquered Armenia in 97 BC, making himself overlord of its ruler Tigranes II, and expanded Parthian territory in the west to the banks of the Euphrates. Mithridates II's conquests, which saw him style himself as King of Kings on his coinage, the first Parthian king to do so, brought the borders of the Parthian realm into contact with a power with whom the Parthians would struggle for hundreds of years: the Romans. In 96 BC, the Parthian ambassador, or Orosanges, agreed with the Roman dictator Sulla that the border between the two burgeoning powers should be set at the Euphrates, an agreement which held, often uneasily, for several decades. In the east, Parthian expansion brought them in close contact with the Chinese Han dynasty, an altogether more peaceful relationship which saw trade within and across Parthia flourish. From 90 to 57 BC, we know very little of Parthia and its rulers, a so-called Parthian Dark Age. It would seem, however, that in the early 1st century BC, Parthia was in an enviable position, a newly established great power whose prestige gave it a place alongside the might of Rome and Han China. Their dominance established, the Parthians would go on to exercise hegemony over the region for centuries, all the while contesting a series of protracted conflicts with the Romans, which would eventually weaken the Parthian Empire to the point of collapse. We shall return to the history later, and instead focus on the society of the Parthians. The Parthian Empire was largely decentralized, divided into numerous kingdoms, vassal states or provinces. The rule of the growing empire and the diversity of its peoples would have been challenging to rule under centralized power, and so these sub-realms were often allowed significant autonomy. Initially, the local dynasties of vassal states were allowed to maintain their rule so long as they acknowledged Parthian sovereignty and paid their tribute. However, as time progressed, particularly under Mithridates II, the Arsacids began replacing these local kings with members of their own family as a means of exercising greater control. The head of the Parthian government came to be known as the King of Kings, a title they inherited from the Achaemenid Empire, and which demonstrated their divine right to rule. The Parthian king was traditionally polygamous and would usually be succeeded by his firstborn son. The sanctity of the royal line was partially maintained by intermarriage amongst kin. Like many other contemporary cultures, the Parthian kings projected their authority through imagery on coins, combining various cultural elements to legitimize their rule. The first Parthian rulers, from Arsaces to Mithridates then, would present themselves wearing a bashlik, a kind of soft cap that harkened back to their nomadic origins. Mithridates II was the first Parthian king to present himself wearing a diadem tied around the hair. The diadem is related to the Macedonian monarchy as a symbol of their royal dignity, but it also shares a long Iranian tradition worn by the Achaemenid King of Kings. Mithridates' use of it appears to be a calculated choice denoting both his succession of Alexander the Great and his Seleucid dynasty, and Parthia's ancient Iranian ties. Another symbol of Parthian kingship became the depiction of the royal wart. From the time of King Orodes II, for roughly the next 100 years, Parthian kings were depicted on coins with the royal wart on their foreheads, likely some sort of hereditary disease or recessive trait. Parthian art indicates that the Arsacid kings sometimes presented themselves as gods and encouraged a cult of the leader, a tradition which likely demonstrates both Hellenistic and earlier Iranian influences. Although the extent to which they themselves or their subjects actually viewed them as divine is unclear, and full deification of kings is unlikely within a Zoroastrian context. The excavations at Old Nisa led to increased discussion of an ancestral cult, and it is now generally interpreted as a ceremonial centre built for Arsacid ancestor veneration. The site contains elaborate structures that appear to have been designed for ritual activities rather than everyday habitation, suggesting a religious purpose centered on honoring the dynasty's founders. The ruling nobility were broadly divided into 3 tiers. Directly below the King of Kings were the regional kings. Below them, those related to the King of Kings, only through marriage. The lowest rungs were the heads of local clans and less significant territories. The King's Council appears to have been made up of members of the nobility, as well as holy priests known as magi who would help advise the king. During the later stages of the Parthian Empire, there were increased disputes over matters of succession, and at least 3 murders are likely attributed to the interference of the nobility. It appears that onwards from the rule of Vologases I, the nobility's influence on the king and power in the empire began to decrease. Arsacid rulers began putting provinces under direct control, placing their own family members in important political positions. We cannot definitively explain the role of slavery in the Parthian Empire, but there are examples from written sources that suggest its presence. In his Life of Crassus, Plutarch mentions that there were many slaves in the entourage of the Parthian general Surena. A number of sources, including Plutarch, also mention that many Romans were captured by the Parthians after the Battle of Carrhae and likely taken into some form of slavery. A Parthian parchment dated to 121 AD from Dura Europos records an agreement between Phraortes, a government official, and Balus, a local farmer. Phraates had lent Balus 400 silver drachmas which he was unable to repay. In the note, the farmer agrees to serve as a slave until the sum of money is repaid, and the note includes a number of harsh stipulations. Whilst we don't know how common these types of agreements were, or how they functioned in broader Parthian society, this provides evidence that some form of indentured servitude existed in the Parthian Empire. Once again, the sources from which we can derive our understanding of Parthian women are scarce, and those we do have refer solely to the nobility. We know the Parthian kings had multiple wives who claimed the title queen, as well as a selection of concubines. Concubines could rise to considerable favour with the king, and it was even possible for their sons to become king themselves, as attested by Vologases the merchant, whose father Vonones II conceived him with a Greek concubine. Whether women generally lived in seclusion from men is not known, and we do have evidence that some women were present at banquets as entertainers. Parthian kings went into battle with full entourages of which women were often a part and were sometimes taken captive by the enemy. The kings were sometimes known to kill the women in their entourage to prevent this from happening. Our evidence shows similarities with Achaemenid predecessors and Sasanian successors, and due to traditions under these empires, it is assumed that Parthian women could also manage their own property and land. We know of some instances in which women achieved substantial power at court. Queen Musa was one of only 3 women to rule as full monarchs in Iranian history. Originally a Roman slave, she was gifted to the Parthian king Phraates IV, whom she then married and later murdered, making herself and her son Phraates joint rulers of the empire. She was also only one of 2 royal women to have ever been depicted on Parthian coins, the second being Queen Ariazate of the vassal kingdom of Elymas, who may have ruled alongside her husband King Camnaskires III. Musa was the only Parthian woman to rule as queen regnant, a ruler in her own right, although Rinu, the queen consort of Mithridates III, ruled as queen regent under her son until her son Phraates VII came of age. Other than these rare exceptions, it seems likely that women did not hold significant political power, although they could leverage their personal relationships with the king to influence his choice of successor. Despite the lack of Parthian sources, there are some other references to Parthian women that suggest the importance that they held in society. A Chinese source named the Shiji reports that it is customary among them to esteem the women, and it is only when something is said by the women that the men find it right to do so. Evidence from Parthian belt buckles perhaps further speaks to this notion of equality, in which couples are depicted with their heads snuggling together. This kind of open display of affection perhaps refers to the Parthians' nomadic roots. In nomadic societies, women typically have a more active role in social life, especially when compared to contemporary sedentary societies. Parthian cultural identity was shaped by multiple historical and multicultural layers. It combined a strong Persian-Iranian heritage with local tribal and nomadic roots, and by the time of their empire had absorbed a range of Greek cultural forms inherited from the Seleucid period. In addition, the Parthians both influenced and were influenced by the diverse cultures within the reaches of their empire. As a result, Parthian rulers often blended cultural forms in their self-representation. They styled themselves after the Persian king of kings, whilst also inscribing the words Philhellene, meaning friend of the Greeks, on their coins to reflect their mixed cultural roots. However, around the reign of Artabanus II, this inscription disappeared, marking a revival of Iranian culture. To reinforce their legitimacy over former Achaemenid territories, the Arsacids leveraged their claimed familial descent from Artaxerxes II of Persia, and they began presenting themselves in apparel that closer represented Achaemenid satraps, and choosing typical Zoroastrian names for themselves. Despite this attempt to distance themselves from Greek culture, Greek alphabet letters were still used on Parthian coins until the collapse of the empire, and many blended cultural elements remained intact. Roman reports claim that Parthian nobles attached importance to hunting, which provided game for their diet, and they were known to indulge in wine, apparently to excess. The Roman cookbook De Recocinaria by Marcus Gavius Apicius includes a recipe to prepare chicken in the Parthian style. It goes as follows: open the chicken at the back end and dress it on a board. Pestle pepper, lovage and some cumin. Moisten it with liquamen and mix it with wine. Put the chicken in an earthen pot and pour the sauce over it. Dissolve some fresh laser in lukewarm water. Pour this over the chicken and let it stew. Sprinkle with pepper and serve. The Parthians were fans of Greek theatre, and theatres dating to Parthian times have been discovered in Babylon, Dura Europos, and Seleucia. Plutarch, in his Life of Crassus, suggested that when the head of Crassus was brought to the Parthian king, Orodes II, after the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BC, he was in the middle of watching a performance of the Bacchae by the Greek playwright Euripides. Plutarch claims that in a moment of gruesome inspiration, the actors used Crassus's severed head as a prop to represent the head of Pentheus. Music would regularly have been heard in Parthian life, with performances during weddings, festivals, public events, and even when marching into war. Pictorial representations have revealed the presence of trumpets, oboes, harps, tambourines, panpipes, double reeds, and other instruments. Plutarch's description of the Battle of Carrhae mentions a procession of musicians that accompanied the warriors, even featuring women playing the castanets. He also claims that they used kettle drums which would unsettle and unnerve their opponents, causing confusion amongst their ranks. Our knowledge of the Parthian military is relatively good, not in small part owing to their long-running rivalry with the Roman Empire. So long-running, in fact, that the Roman-Parthian wars are deemed to have lasted some 270 years, from the mid-1st century BC up until the end of the Parthian Empire itself, in the early 3rd century AD. Unlike the Romans, the Parthians had no standing army. Instead, Parthian kings would call upon their vassals to provide them with troops in a somewhat feudal fashion reminiscent of medieval Europe. Additionally, mercenaries were also utilized. The strength of such a system was its relative simplicity. The Parthian monarch did not need to maintain an expensive and complex standing army, and could instead raise the forces of his realm as and when they were required for a campaign. However, this system had serious drawbacks too. Vassal troops led by vassal lords were rarely fond of long campaigns, being primarily concerned with returning to their estates as soon as possible, particularly close to seasonal harvests. As such, Parthian kings were not especially well equipped for lengthy campaigns. What is more, the longer a Parthian monarch spent abroad, the more the risk of a rebellion occurring at home increased. The great emphasis of Parthian martial prowess centered around cavalry, as Parthia appears to have been renowned for the quality of its horses, whom Strabo notes for their speed compared to the horses of the Romans and other peoples. For not only are they faster, but they are also smoother runners than the other horses. Furthermore, Strabo notes the quality of the land in Parthia for the raising of horses, making mention of a region which was particularly famous for the pasturing of horses close to the Caspian Gates, the name given to one of several mountain passes in Persia, the Caucasus, or Anatolia. Those who travel from Persia and Babylon to the Caspian Gates pass through it, and in the time of the Persians it is said that 50,000 mares were pastured in it, and these herds belonged to the kings. As for the Nisaean horses, which the kings used because they were the best and the largest, some writers say that the breed came from here, whilst others say from Armenia. They are characteristically different in form, as are also the Parthian horses as they are now called, as compared with the Helic and other horses in our country. Strabo also makes reference here to the Nisaean horse, a particularly large horse breed apparently renowned throughout the ancient world, and which is now unfortunately extinct. These extremely prestigious horses were apparently ridden by the Parthian royalty. Herodotus, writing around 430 BC, also explains where these great beasts' origins lay. Now, these horses are called Nisaean because they come from the Nisaean plain, a vast flat in Media producing horses of unusual size. Let me show you numbers that illustrate Parthian cavalry supremacy. A typical Parthian army might consist of 10,000 to 20,000 cavalry and only 2,000 to 5,000 infantry. This represents a cavalry to infantry ratio of approximately 4 to 1 or 5 to 1, vastly higher than the roughly 1 to 10 ratio typical of Roman armies. Parthian horses were bred specifically for warfare, with training beginning at age 3 and continuing for 2 years before the horses were considered combat-ready at age 5. Parthian cavalry troops primarily came in 2 forms: lightly armoured and highly manoeuvrable mounted archers, and heavy cavalry known as cataphracts, bedecked in heavy chainmail armour. The Parthians were also known to have made use of camel-mounted troops, although in far smaller numbers than horse cavalry. Camels, whilst generally slower, are hardier than horses and better suited to some of the harsh arid terrains that made up parts of the Parthian realm. Usually equipped with a short sword and dressed in a simple tunic and trousers, perhaps with the addition of padded fabric armour, Parthian light cavalry primarily depended upon their powerful recurve bows, constructed of a composite of wood, horn, and sinew, to deal damage. Parthian light cavalry became famed for the so-called Parthian shot, a manoeuvre in which a mounted warrior would turn in his saddle and fire directly behind him at pursuing enemy troops. As the Parthian shot required the rider to remove both his hands from the reins in order to use his bow and twist 180 degrees in his saddle, all whilst using little more than balance, for stirrups had not been invented at this time, it is a testament to the extraordinary horsemanship of the Parthians. 2nd century AD historian Justin explained the hit-and-run tactics used by Parthian cavalry, of engaging with the enemy in close fight, and taking cities by siege they know nothing. They fight on horseback, either galloping forward or turning their backs. Often, too, they counterfeit flight that they may throw their pursuers off their guard against being wounded by their arrows. Cataphracts, on the other hand, were extremely heavily armed and armoured, clad all in chainmail or metal scale armour, and customarily wielding a long lance, alongside a powerful longsword for hacking at the enemy. The great horses of Parthian cataphracts would have similarly been covered in armour, making them incredibly hard to bring down in combat. The vast weight of the massed cataphract charges were used to break enemy formations, and their heavy armour allowed these Parthian cavalrymen to engage effectively in prolonged melee. The Romans themselves experienced the great effectiveness of Parthian mounted warfare on many occasions, and particularly at the 53 BC Battle of Carrhae. 7 legions of heavy Roman infantry led by Marcus Licinius Crassus were lured into the flat desert terrain near the town of Carrhae. Constant harrying by Parthian light cavalry inflicted heavy casualties on the Romans, whose attempts to break ranks and engage the mounted archers failed. When the legionaries formed a defensive testudo formation in response to the hail of arrows falling upon their heads, they became sitting ducks for the repeated charges of the cataphracts, whose immense bulk broke open the Roman formations, inflicting still more casualties and leaving them open to Parthian bow fire. In the words of Cassius Dio, "For if they decided to lock shields for the purpose of avoiding the arrows by the closeness of their array, the pikemen were upon them with a rush, striking down some and at least scattering the others, and if they extended their ranks to avoid this, they would be struck with the arrows." Whilst nowhere near as pivotal as the cavalry, Parthian armies did make use of infantry, generally a lightly armed and armoured variety drawn from vassals. Infantry would have had little role to play in the kind of cavalry-centric tactics described earlier, and would therefore primarily have been used to occupy and hold ground on the battlefield, or else for guard duty while on campaign and garrisoning forts and settlements. Owing to its position on both north-south and east-west routes, trade formed a crucial element of the Parthian economy. In particular, the Silk Road was the main artery of commerce passing through Parthian territory, and notably the prestigious cities of Ecbatana and Merv. The rivers of Mesopotamia, the Tigris, Euphrates and Karun, facilitated trade too, allowing maritime commerce along the Persian Gulf and onwards to India, especially through the major port city of Charax-Spasinu. The economic importance of trade was, like other elements of the Parthian Empire, inherited from the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Despite this, it appears that the government of Parthia did not pursue any particular kind of trade policy. There were apparently no tariffs nor state-sponsored trade initiatives. So despite the immense wealth that long-distance commerce brought to Parthia, there is little evidence that the royal coffers benefited from it very much. That said, our knowledge of Parthian trade is rather sparse, so it is certainly possible that some form of toll was levied on passing trade caravans travelling through Parthia. Parthian coinage, which was based on the Seleucid coinage of the drachma, helped to facilitate long-distance trade. We do know, however, what the Parthians bought and sold: silk, jade, and minerals from China, and metals as manufactured goods from the Romans. In return, the Parthians exported a number of specialized goods. Horses, in particular the Nisaean horses mentioned earlier, wood, slaves, spices, pomegranates, pearls, vines, alfalfa, and even exotic animals such as lions and ostriches. Parthian merchants were highly active participants in long-distance trade routes. Beyond trade, the land of Parthia itself yielded various kinds of natural bounty from which its inhabitants profited. The Zagros Mountains and other highland regions of Iran were home to a rich variety of mineral resources, primarily gold, silver, copper, and iron. These metals were crucial in the production of jewellery, tools, weapons, and armour, and could of course be traded as commodities. The large mountain forests which clung to the slopes of the highland regions of Parthia provided the wood and charcoal to feed the smelters and metalwork facilities. Ore deposits could also yield zinc, tungsten, cobalt, lead, and tin. Salt was also mined and was an oft-traded resource. Although large portions of Parthian territory were effectively desert, other regions such as Mesopotamia, the borders of the Zagros Mountains, and Elamar were highly fertile and very suitable for the growing of wheat, barley and oats, cereals which would have formed part of the everyday diet alongside lentils, beans, peas, onions, garlic and cabbage. In less fertile regions, underground irrigation and water storage systems known as qanats were utilized, a system which had been in use since the 8th century BC. In Syria and Mesopotamia, olives thrived, their oil used for cooking and for body care. Fruits were popular too, and a flourishing garden culture, perhaps inherited from the Achaemenids, saw the widespread cultivation of apples, figs, plums and pears amongst others, as well as various kinds of nuts. Animal husbandry was widespread. Sheep, goats, cattle, donkeys and poultry were all bred for their meat and for other useful products such as leather and hair. Horses were of course bred all across Parthia, in Fars, the Hamadan Plateau, around Nisa, and east of the Caspian Sea. Camels were also bred for use as pack animals. Wine was of great importance in Parthia, having been made in Iran since the 5th millennium BC, generally drunk diluted and often as a substitute for water, of which clean sources were often hard to come by. Wine had an important economic place too, since vineyards were taxed, and its production therefore represented a source of income for the Parthian state. Unfortunately, like most ancient languages, the Parthian language is extinct. We do know, however, that like the Parthians themselves, the language was part of the Indo-European language family. More specifically, Parthian was a northwestern Iranian language. Despite sharing many similarities with Middle Persian, which went on to become the primary literary language of the Sasanian Empire, Parthian is quite distinct. The Paeani likely adopted the local Parthian language upon conquering the region in the 3rd century BC when they underwent the cultural transformation which led to the creation of the Parthian polity. However, Parthian was by no means the only language spoken in the Parthian Empire. Alongside the myriad local languages spoken by peoples living in vassal states and subject territories, Aramaic and Greek were particularly important. Aramaic, thought to have been a sort of lingua franca and the administrative language of the Achaemenid Persians, continued to be used, and Greek, the administrative language of the Greek-speaking Seleucid emperors, was also adopted by the Parthians. This is evidenced by the use of Greek on Parthian coinage until the mid-1st century AD. Despite the continued use of these two tongues, Parthian eventually eclipsed them both as the preferred language of administration. Parthian was written using what is known as Pahlavi, a writing system derived from Aramaic and which was used for writing a number of other Iranian languages such as Middle Persian. Having originated in Aramaic, Pahlavi therefore contains a good deal of Aramaic loanwords and influences. The fact that Parthian is an Indo-Iranian language written using a Semitic script presented many challenges for those attempting to decipher it, for Semitic languages are consonantal with the vowels being inferred by the reader. Comparison with Armenian was crucial in understanding Parthian, as the Armenian language was heavily influenced by Parthian from centuries of Arsacid rule in the region. A small number of texts written in Parthian survive, including a 1st century AD parchment detailing a land sale and a 120-verse poem known as the Ayadgar Zereren, or the Babylonian Tree. A number of inscriptions also survive, although precious few of them are complete. Some 3,000 pottery fragments inscribed with Parthian have been discovered at the site of Nisa in Turkmenistan, dating from the 1st century BC, and a number of later 8th to 11th century AD manuscripts found at the oasis of Turfan. Religious belief under the Parthian Empire was far from homogeneous. As the empire expanded and absorbed neighbouring territories, it came to include a wide variety of religious traditions and practices. In an effort to promote stability, it seems that Parthian kings exercised religious tolerance, largely allowing the lives and religious practices of their vassal states to continue as normal. Due to this broad cultural and religious diversity, as well as the scarcity of contemporaneous sources, it is impossible to make definitive claims about the beliefs of the Parthian kings or their general population. However, we can identify and surmise likely trends such as the presence of Zoroastrian practices, the persistence of polytheistic traditions, and the influence of Greek, Mesopotamian, and Central Asian religions. Information regarding the religion of the Parthians prior to the beginning of their empire is practically non-existent, although it is assumed that it was likely of a polytheistic nature. And throughout the empire it seems that apart from the minority of Jews and a few early Christians, most Parthians held a polytheistic worldview. The most clear and consistent evidence we have points towards the presence and prevalence of the Zoroastrian faith. Although our understanding of it under the Parthian Empire is incomplete, Zoroastrianism had been the state religion of the Achaemenid Empire, which preceded the Parthians, as well as the later Sasanian Empire that followed it. The archaeological evidence does support the prevalence of the Zoroastrian religion, but it is important to note that many of our more far-reaching conclusions are made by inference from earlier or later sources. Zoroastrianism is an Iranian religion based on the teachings of a figure known as Zarathustra Spitama, more commonly referred to by the Greek translation Zoroaster. Primarily concerned with the conflict between good and evil, Zoroastrian teaching revolves around the supreme deity and creator of the world, Ahura Mazda, representing good, and his counterpart Ahriman, also known as Angra Mainyu, representing evil. Man must choose between these forces, and as a result of his act in life will either go to heaven or to hell to atone for his sins. The extent to which the Arsacid ruling family adopted Zoroastrianism is debated. We have knowledge of bloody sacrifices enacted by some Parthian-era Iranian cults, which were incompatible with Zoroastrianism. However, there is considerable evidence for the worship of Zoroastrian deities, including divine imagery on coinage, adherence in places to the Zoroastrian calendar, and kinship intermarriage amongst the Arsacids, a practice endorsed within Zoroastrianism. Fire was sacred in the Zoroastrian religion, being viewed as a pure element, and it was only in the presence of fire that prayers should be addressed to Ahura Mazda. Representations of fire altars can be seen throughout the Achaemenid, Parthian and Sasanian empires. We have some Parthian sources for the presence of this sacred fire. Isidore of Charax claims that the eternal fire of the Zoroastrians was being kept in the city of Asak, where Arsaces was proclaimed king, and images of a fire altar can be found on coins minted under numerous Arsacid kings. The fire altar appeared regularly as an iconographic motif of the Achaemenids, and ties Parthian-era religious practice to a longer Iranian tradition. The ancient Iranian god Mithra, who was incorporated into Zoroastrianism, was particularly important to the Parthians. Mithra was portrayed as the sun god and known as the guardian of the law. His association with authority explains the prevalence of the name Mithridates amongst Parthian kings, meaning given by Mithra. Mithra worship was particularly prevalent amongst the Iranian peoples in Central Asia and eastern Iran, and there is considerable evidence for his elevated status amongst the Parthian royal line. There is also reference to the presence and importance of the Magi in the Parthian Empire, members of the Zoroastrian priestly class who were responsible for religious life and keepers of its traditions. In the early phases of the empire, magi were known to be members of the royal councils that in times of crisis would select or confirm the new king. The Greek text of Matthew in the New Testament speaks of the magi who came to visit Jesus after his birth, later translated to the wise men coming from the east and up to Bethlehem. These wise men would have travelled through an area that at the time corresponded to the Parthian Empire, and it has been suggested that they may have been of Parthian origin. There is also evidence for Hellenistic influence on Parthian religion and the blending of local deities. Following Alexander the Great's conquest, much of Iran came under the rule of his Greco-Macedonian successors, the Seleucid dynasty, and as a result, many Iranian deities came to be associated with Greek counterparts as the Seleucids sought to legitimize their rule and ingratiate themselves to the local populations. Zeus became associated with the Zoroastrian Ahura Mazda. Anahita, the best known of the Persian goddesses, became equated with Artemis and Athena, and the sun god Mithra became associated with Helios and Apollo. The blending of these identities was passed down through the Parthian Empire, with evidence for their continued doubling. A Greek Parthian inscription found on a statue celebrating a Parthian victory names both the Zoroastrian Verethragna and the Greek demigod Hercules in the dedication. It is uncertain whether the Parthians portrayed their gods anthropomorphically before the Hellenistic influence, but it is clear that after intensive contact with Hellenism, Parthian depictions of gods used a Greek model. The religion of Manichaeism, a belief system followed by the church father Augustine of Hippo in his youth, was founded by a Parthian. Mani, alive between approximately 216 to 274 AD, was a member of the Parthian nobility. His new religious movement sought to unite the major faiths of the time, incorporating elements of Judaism, Zoroastrianism, Christianity, and even Buddhism, while keeping at its core the age-old struggle between good and evil. It is not surprising that the religion of Manichaeism sprung from this Parthian melting pot of religious belief, with Mani's syncretic approach seeking to integrate diverse traditions into a coherent framework. Parthian art is a highly debated topic. Oft discussed over the past 90 years is whether or not an artistic style that was distinctively Parthian even existed, or whether the artistic works produced by the Parthians were simply a reflection of the Hellenistic and local styles which existed in the region long before the Parni. Frontality, the depiction of figures or objects in relief directly facing the viewer, has often been cited as an example of a style which may be more distinctly Parthian, although they may not have invented this technique themselves. Although still debated, it is generally agreed that no monolithic Parthian art existed. Rather, that just as the lands ruled by the Arsacid dynasty were made up of distinct realms and peoples, so too was art in Parthia made up of an array of styles and influences. In particular, Greek and Roman influences abound, but art produced within the enormous Parthian Empire must have also been influenced by Iranian and Syrian styles. The difficulties we have in characterizing art from the Arsacid kingdom are further compounded by a relative scarcity of finds from the heartlands of the empire. Finds from Syria and Mesopotamia are rather more common, reflecting the tastes of the local elites, but artifacts from the royal heartlands, from cities such as Nisa, are harder to come by. Sculptural works are the perfect example of the hybrid nature of art in Parthia. Excellent examples are Rita, carved from ivory, discovered at the royal palace of Nisa. These probably 1st century BC drinking horns are not only exquisitely detailed, displaying a high level of artistic competence amongst the craftsmen of Nysa, but they clearly demonstrate a number of influences. Horns of this kind, decorated with various creatures, were certainly popular with the preceding Achaemenid Persian dynasty, but the Parthian horns conspicuously depict Greek mythological scenes, gods and goddesses, poets, and feasting. That said, some do depict hybrid creatures such as chimeras and griffin-like beasts and bull-men. Local inspirations can apparently be seen too. One horn shows a woman hunting with a net, and another herding her goats. Bronze figural sculptures are extant in small numbers, as are a number of rock and stone reliefs. A particularly striking example found at Behistun is known as the Vologeses relief, displaying the king sacrificing at an altar. Similarly, a stone relief depicting a sacrificial scene survives, showing the Parthian king once again at an altar. The figure to the right of the altar is thought to represent the king of Elymais due to his distinctive costume. All the figures wear the easily identifiable Parthian trousers. Sculpture was not the only medium practiced in Parthia. Frescoes have been found throughout the empire in a variety of localized styles. Some depict hunting scenes with archers wielding composite bows, others scenes of sacrifice. A fascinating painting from the Temple of Bel at Dura-Europos shows a sacrifice performed by a white-robed priest as he places something into a tall vessel which appears to be billowing smoke. Mosaic was also practiced, and Parthian craftsmen produced smaller decorative objects, many of them for personal consumption. Glassware was certainly made, but very few of these survive. Terracotta vessels, many of them in the shape of animals, are more numerous. We can glimpse Parthian jewellery from depictions of kings on coinage and from archaeological finds. Although likely a preserve of the rich and elite, torques were worn, a kind of necklace with spiral golden bands, often depicting animals. Notably, these torques are an example of steppe nomadic artistic influences. Golden earrings were common, and plain circular examples exist alongside very elaborate designs. Belt buckles survive with varied designs too. One rather lovely buckle displays a couple embracing. Parthia's period of great imperial power, from the early 1st century BC until the mid-1st century AD, was arguably defined by its conflicts with Rome. Indeed, the Roman-Parthian Wars, deemed to have lasted until the fall of the Parthian Empire itself in the early 3rd century AD, began in 53 BC when the Roman general and member of the First Triumvirate, Marcus Licinius Crassus, attacked the Parthians repeatedly in the pursuit of power and prestige that successful military campaigning generally bestowed upon Roman politicians. Beaver points out that throughout these wars between Rome and Parthia, the Parthians rarely initiated conflict. Rather, it was Roman expansionist tendencies which most often brought the two to blows, along with disputes over satellite powers or buffer states, most notably Armenia, a relatively powerful polity which bordered both Parthia and Rome, and became something of a political football, with both empires seeking to bring the kingdom under their sway. In 69 BC, Roman consul Lucius Licinius Lucullus defeated King Tigranes of Armenia, which then became a Roman vassal state under Pompey the Great in 64 BC. It may well have been the strong political position of Pompey which prompted the ambitious Crassus, reputed to have been the richest man in Rome, to launch an assault upon Parthia with the intention of winning glory for himself. The Parthian king Orodes II sought to avoid war by sending emissaries to Crassus, who were ignored. Orodes, who had murdered his father Phraates III and slain his brother Mithridates III in battle to assume the throne, had in fact forced Armenia to become a Parthian vassal and captured sections of the Levant. It is perhaps not surprising that such expansion roused Roman ire. Moving against the Parthians at the head of an army of some 40,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry, Crassus faced Orodes' troops, led by the general Surena, south of Karhay in modern Turkey. The Battle of Karhay was an unmitigated disaster for Crassus, and has gone down in history as one of Rome's worst defeats. The heavily armoured infantry of the Roman army were outmanoeuvred by the highly mobile Parthian light cavalry, who poured hails of deadly arrows onto the Roman troops. When they formed a defensive testudo by interlocking their shields, the legionnaires were at the mercy of the Parthian heavy cavalry, the cataphracts, who smashed into their lines. Although the Romans were able to retreat to Karhay, they left thousands of dead strewn on the battlefield, sustaining perhaps as many as 20,000 casualties. The utter defeat of Crassus's army was guaranteed when the Roman general himself was killed, apparently in a melee which took place when he met with the Parthians in order to negotiate a peace. Thousands of Roman soldiers were taken captive, many of them apparently being sent to Merv and forced to dig the great ring city fortifications which can still be seen to this day. The story of Crassus being tortured and killed by having molten gold poured into his mouth, traumatic though it is almost certainly a later invention. And the Parthians, as some say, poured molten gold into his mouth in mockery, for though a man of vast wealth, he had set so great a store by money as to pity those who could not support an enrolled legion by their own means, regarding them as poor men. Although a de facto peace had been established, Parthia itself was by no means an entirely peaceful place. Civil strife was a constant menace, particularly when it came to the succession of the Parthian throne. Of the 15 monarchs who ruled Parthia between 70 BC and 51 AD, 7 or 8 perished at the hands of their family members or at the hands of their own nobles. Orodes' son, Phraates IV, is supposed to have murdered 30 of his own brothers in a brutal grab for the throne in 38 BC. Roman aggression flared again in 36 BC when Mark Antony led a force which reportedly numbered some 80,000 men into Parthian Atropatene. But the destruction of his siege engines and baggage train by Parthian cavalry effectively ended the campaign, forcing the Romans to withdraw. It was only in 20 BC that Augustus Caesar was able to negotiate a lasting peace with the Parthians under Phraates IV, fixing the border between the two empires at the Euphrates River and facilitating the return of the Roman eagles which had been lost at the ignominious defeat at Karhay. Although the return of the eagles, as depicted on the breastplate of the famous marble statue of Augustus held at the Vatican Museum, shows the Parthian as an inferior barbarian, it is clear from the treaty that Parthia was the equal of Augustus's new empire. The next few decades passed in relative peace with the odd political upheaval. For example, around the year 11 BC, when the Roman-supported Vonones III was defeated and usurped by Artabanustus, who had the support of the Parthian nobles. Artabanus II's reign in particular was a stable one, in which Parthian control over more westerly lands such as Atropatene and Elymais was more firmly entrenched. However, it was with the death of Artabanus that a new period of instability would begin within the Parthian Empire, political turmoil which would first weaken and then break apart the once mighty kingdom. It must be noted that the decline of the Parthians was extremely protracted. Although serious political fracturing within the empire began in the 1st century AD, it is important to point out just how difficult maintaining a large and disparate realm would have been. What is more, the Parthian Empire effectively lasted over 150 years more into the early 3rd century AD. Upon the death of Artabanus II in 38 AD, a civil conflict erupted between his two sons, Vardennes and Gotarzes, a conflict which lasted several years and severely damaged the unity of Parthia's disparate realms. It should be noted that during such periods of instability, the various client rulers which made up the Parthian Empire were far more likely to seize the opportunity to establish greater independence for themselves. It was only the reign of Vologases from 51 until 78 or 79 AD which stabilized the febrile political atmosphere. Vologases achieved this largely by appointing his close family members and other Arsacid princes on the thrones of various subject or vassal states such as Characene and Elymais. He was even able to place his brother Tiridates on the throne of Armenia. As it had been for decades, Armenia was the primary point of contention between Rome and Parthia, namely which of these two great empires exercised hegemony over the Caucasian buffer state. In 66 AD, the two powers came to an agreement which allowed the Arsacid Tiridates to remain on the throne, while submitting to Roman overlordship. He was crowned in Rome in the presence of the Emperor Nero. Although the peace held, Rome did continue to expand eastwards, making Commagene a vassal state around 72 AD. Despite this, the reign of Vologases was a stable and successful one. Parthia flourished in an economic sense. Urban centres expanded and new cities were built such as Vologesacerta and Vologesius. Indeed, during the reign of Vologases' son Pacorustet, a trade delegation were apparently sent to China in order to further promote commerce between the two nations. It was during the fractious reign of Vologases III, which lasted from 105 until 147 AD, that Parthian woes began in earnest. The new monarch, although apparently uncontested upon his coronation, had to deal with 3 separate rebel kings during his reign, which lasted for almost the entirety of his rule. It is unclear exactly which parts of the empire Vologases ruled. However, we know that from 109 to 129, a king named Osroes, who claimed to be the ruler of Parthia and enjoyed the support of Rome, exercised control over sections of the empire, perhaps in part tempted by the opportunity presented by this political volatility, and certainly in reaction to Osroes' appointment of his brother Pathamasiris to the throne of Armenia. In 113 AD, the Romans struck eastwards. From 114 to 117 AD, the Emperor Trajan waged successive campaigns, first seizing Armenia before marching on Mesopotamia. The Parthian capital of Ctesiphon was captured in 116 AD, and Roman control extended down to the Persian Gulf, leading to the creation of Roman provinces in Armenia, Assyria, and Mesopotamia. The situation was not to last, however. The civil unrest in these newly conquered lands, combined with Trajan's ill health, allowed Osroes to swiftly retake Mesopotamia, although Nisibis, Adiabene, and Armenia remained under Roman hegemony. Vologases IV's rule began as a relatively peaceful one, that is until 161 AD, when the Parthian king launched an assault upon the Romans, notably the first and only time that a Parthian monarch declared war upon Rome as the aggressor. The exact reason for this war is unclear, although it is likely that once again it revolved around supremacy over Armenia. In any case, the Parthians struck hard, rapidly overrunning Armenia, Adiabene and Nisibis, and even reaching as far as Syria. But this was not to last, as between 162 and 166 AD, the Roman general Lucius Verus, sent by the emperor Marcus Aurelius, systematically expelled the Parthians from Armenia and Syria before advancing through Mesopotamia and conquering Seleucia and Ctesiphon. It was only a bout of severe plague, likely the bacteria Yersinia pestis, which was responsible for the later Black Death, which forced the Romans to retreat. Roman troops carried this deadly disease back to Italy, where its devastating effects became known as the Antonine Plague. The loss of territory was further compounded in the 190s AD, when Parthian support for rebel movements in Roman-occupied Osrhoene and Adiabene enraged the Emperor Septimius Severus. Taking Osrhoene in 195 AD, Roman troops continued through Mesopotamia, once again conquering Seleucia and Ctesiphon in 198 AD, with large numbers of the city's inhabitants reportedly enslaved. This time, however, there was no rapid Roman withdrawal. Instead, the empire held Mesopotamia, creating a new province. The plundering of its fertile and wealthy Mesopotamian lands through which rich trade passed was a disaster for the Parthians. This territorial shrinking no doubt led to serious economic decline and social upheaval. That political instability resulted is evidenced by the civil war that erupted following the death of Vologases V in 208 AD between his two sons, Vologases VI and Artabanus IV. The battle between these brothers, which appears to have lasted some 8 years, pulled the empire apart. The Roman Emperor Caracalla, seeing an opportunity, invaded Adiabene and Armenia. Although the triumphant Artabanus was able to defeat the Romans at the Battle of Nisibis in 217 AD, he was forced to cede supremacy over Armenia to Rome. Artabanus, although victorious, ruled over a much diminished realm. Parthia was racked with civil unrest. Its armies were largely spent, and its riches dwindling due to enormous territorial losses and year-on-year of campaigning. It was this political weakness which spelled the end for the Parthians. But the force which would end the Arsacid dynasty was not the Romans or some other external power. Rather, it was Ardashir, a king who ruled in Fars, a region which had long been subject to the power of the Parthian throne, who would overthrow and end the Parthian Empire. Taking advantage of the power vacuum that existed in the region following the civil war of Artabanus and Vologases, King Ardashir expanded into western Iran and Mesopotamia in 221 AD, taking the major city of Susa. Artabanus IV, despite his weakness, saw such expansionism by the vassal state as unacceptable and confronted the upstart Ardashir. The decision was to prove disastrous. Artabanus IV was defeated and killed at the 224 Battle of Hormizdagan. The death of Artabanus, the last true king of Parthia, spelled the end for the Arsacid dynasty and the Parthian Empire, a realm which had lasted for over 400 years. Although Artabanus's brother Vologases may have ruled in his own right for several more years, his last coins were apparently minted in 228 AD. He cannot have reigned over more than a minor successor state in the ruins of the once proud Parthian Empire. Occupying the mighty Parthian capital of Ctesiphon, the victorious Ardashir established the Sasanian Empire, adopting many elements of Parthian imperialism and culture. The fate of the Parthians is unclear, although they were most likely subsumed into the Sasanian Empire and its rapidly flourishing society. In Armenia, a branch of the Arsacid family ruled for some 200 years more, until the region was ultimately conquered by the Sasanians, who were themselves defeated and subjugated by the conquering armies of the Rashidun Caliphate in the 630s and 640s AD.